One of the most useful applications for storytelling I've found over the years is to use it as a non-confrontational way to help somebody look at themselves. Where if you directly confronted them about some behavior that was unproductive. So let's say it's a manager who doesn't listen to their people or maybe is acting in disrespectful ways and just says, hey, my people just need to suck it up. This is work. It's not play. Or um, I'm thinking of a career coaching client I had who I experienced as often, oftentimes being sort of inappropriate with his humor and at the same time being really proud of his sense of humor, mentioning it multiple times, like I'm really funny. Oops. So how do you can how do you confront a person without being confrontational? Or maybe a better way of saying is, how do you help a person become more self-aware and self-reflective without them feeling confronted and therefore triggering defensiveness, resistance to your message, or triggering shame, which then definitely triggers defensiveness and resistance. And so one of the ways that I think of storytelling, it's sort of like if you have to give a dog some kind of medication that doesn't taste good, you can put it in peanut butter. Then dog just munches it right down. That stories are like peanut butter to difficult to hear messages. So let me give you some examples of what I mean. So this first example is a story I've shared over the years. Typically, if I'm working with a group of managers and we're talking about employee engagement and their behavior and how that affects whether employees want to do their best work, whether employees feel bonded to the organization, or whether they feel subtly and increasingly more disconnected, disenfranchised, and maybe even resentful, and become that way because little micro moments of disrespect and thoughtlessness. And so, typically in any group, there's some like kind of old school hardcore managers who hang on to that mindset of like, hey, I just get to be who I am, and it's their job to figure out how to deal with me. Or like, I'm not into this touchy feely stuff. We've got work to do, and that's my job, is to get them to work hard. That sort of old school personality. And so one of the stories that I will oftentimes share as a way to help them begin to look at the unintended consequences of their behavior, and oftentimes the unrecognized consequences of their behavior. So here's an example. So years ago, I was brought into a company by the VP of operations because he was really frustrated with the management team he had inherited. He was hired by a multinational corporation to take charge of a number of manufacturing plants in this company that they had purchased. And his job was to reduce costs by improving efficiencies. And that wasn't happening. And his attitude was like, what's up with my team? It's a lousy team. So I did a series of interviews with his team members, and believe me, I got an earful about how angry and resentful they were, about how just really disrespectful and, at times abusive he was in his treatment of them. uh, just being mocking and sarcastic in front of team, always having to be the smartest guy in the room, being very blunt and abrasive, etc. Part of it, I think, was a cultural difference. He came from a culture that being very confrontational was the norm. And this was a US company or plant where that's not necessarily the norm. So my job is to help him see what's going on with his managers. And so I put together the report with a bunch of verbatims of what his managers were saying, my assessment, et cetera. And it was really poignant as he was reading the report. He's like getting more and more flustered and frustrated. And he's like looking at this and he goes, there's not a single thing in here about improving efficiencies. They're not thinking about improving efficiencies. What's wrong with them? And I'm thinking to myself, they don't care about efficiencies. That's not on their mind because they hate you. All that they're thinking about is how rude you are to them. That's what's on their mind. But I'm obviously not going to say that to them. So I say it in a more professional way. Okay, so let me stop. So what happened in this story? Now, I'm talking about somebody else. I'm not directly addressing anybody in the audience. I'm not confronting anybody. I'm just telling a story about this person. So if you're somebody in the audience who's one of those like old school managers, I'm not saying, hey, Joe, if you're wondering why you have low engagement, here's probably why. Like you think if somebody if attacked you that way and got in your face, you would feel defensive and resistant. And you'd probably dismiss what he said or she said as like, oh, they're a jerk. They don't understand my situation. But because I'm just telling a story about somebody else, there's no need to defend it or defend against it. You can take it in. And one of the terms that I love from Dr. Milton Erickson, who was the internationally renowned hypnotherapist who I studied from his students. He had passed away by the time I engaged in training. And he was just a therapeutic magician. He was just amazing. And one of the things that he said about storytelling, he described it as a therapy of politeness. I'm not talking about therapy here. I'm talking about communication. It's a communication of politeness. It's sort of like challenging in a polite, gentle way, because again, it's not a direct challenge. You're just telling a story. And because of that, the person doesn't have to defend against it. Another little nuance, and this actually comes from my background in hypnosis, the part where I said, like, I'm thinking to myself, dude, they're not focusing on efficiencies because they hate you. All they're thinking about is how rude you are to them. That's what they're thinking about. That's what's on their mind. So that's what Erickson described as speaking in quotes, where in this case, I didn't actually speak it to the person who was going on in my mind, but it could be literally speaking. Like, so I said to him, do you realize what you're doing? Et cetera, et cetera. That one of the things that Erickson noted, and then also Richard Bandler and John Grinder, the founders of neuro-linguistic programming, recognized in analyzing why was Erickson such an amazingly powerful change agent through nuanced, sophisticated communication, is that the speaking in quotes, what happens is you're hearing it as a story at the conscious level, because I'm just telling you what I thought in my mind as I was dealing with this gentleman. But at the psychological limbic system level, so the limbic system, primitive emotional processing part of the brain, it hits as a direct message. Let me give you another example of this. Well, period. I won't do lots of context. So I remember years ago, I was watching a DVD of this guy giving a presentation at a conference. And it was a conference of entrepreneurs. And he was talking about when he was starting in his entrepreneurial career, he went to a conference and he was thinking to himself, like, these people on stage aren't any better than I am. I can do what they're doing. Well, like, how come I'm not? And then he's thinking more about like like, how come not? And then he goes something like this. So I thought, you know what? You can do this. There's nothing stopping you. The only thing is you need to get off your butt and don't be a wimp. Go out there and do it. He said a much more intense version of that message, a very in your face message. And I remember thinking as he's saying this, I'm taking it in as a message to me. And I'm like, yes, I get it. I get it. You need to get more in action and don't be a big baby and worry about rejection or what people will think, etc. And so the storyteller part of me is thinking, this is interesting, because if he was in a one-on-one coaching session with me, or if he singled me out in an audience and he said that to me, like I'll just say the easier version, like, don't be a baby, don't be a wimp and get off your butt. If he said that to me, even though the message was valid, I would be like, don't talk to me that way. And I would feel like angry and resentful and might get so, hyper focused on the messenger, that I would forget the message, and it would pollute the incredible value of the message. But because he was saying it to himself and he was sharing it with an audience, it was like 2 times removed, and I could take it in. And I've actually shared that story with audiences. So it's like 3 times removed. It's me telling a story that somebody else told an audience that he was telling himself. And so that's another example of sharing a message that might be hard to hear if you were directly confronting the person. But if you say it in a story, they can just take it as a story and let it percolate. And either they can take it in then, or it can percolate in hours, days, weeks, or months later. It can emerge as a, like, you know what, I really need to look at that. So here's another example of a story that really lends itself to inviting somebody to examine how they are showing up in the world and maybe do some self-reflection. And again, because it's a story, inviting them to do that without being confrontational and doing it in, I think, a pretty fascinating way. It's also a great example of being very mindful as you go about your life, whether it's reading, watching a YouTube video, podcast, etc. And so I can't remember when I first came across this story, but it's about Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, who was a Hungarian physician and scientist who lived in the mid 19th century. And he discovered that if he washed his hands after conducting autopsies, and between conducting autopsies and then delivering babies, surprise, surprise, fewer mothers died during childbirth due to what was called, I think, childbirth fever. At that time, people didn't know about bacteria, about, quote, germs. And so there was no perceived need for hand washing. And he did some experiments and found that washing hands dramatically reduced the percentage, but he didn't know why. And he published his results, and he was greeted with mockery by his colleagues because there was no reason, no understandable reason for what he was saying. And also It flew in the face of what was considered, settled science back there or back then, and just like obvious, self-evident um, truths. And uh, when I read about that and just how he was so publicly derided, um, I remember thinking, there we go again. What a classic example of the arrogance of ignorance, and how so often throughout history, when people challenge the status quo, challenge what's considered self-evident, how instead of met with curiosity, they're met with derision. And so that was the takeaway message that I had from that story. And that could be a perfect, tie it up in a nice bow story if that's the point you want to deliver. Now, scene two, I'm reading a Seth Godin book, and he brings up good old Ignaz Semmelweis. I'm like, oh yeah, poor Ignaz. What a bummer. And then though, Seth Godin goes on to talk about, and I think he heard about this from Atul Gawande, the neurosurgeon who's written a bunch of bestsellers, Checklist Manifesto, Better, I think How Doctors Think, maybe. Anyway, great writer and also a neurosurgeon. And so Seth Godin, when he talked about Semmelweis, and then he said, the reason why Semmelweis was met with such antagonism was Semmelweis was a jerk. I'm like, say what? And then he goes on to describe these incredibly like sarcastic, vitriolic, hateful things that Semmelweis would say about his colleagues. In fact, he would write them letters and, like, dear Herr, Professor so-and-so, I hope you're happy knowing that you're contributing to the murder of young women, stuff that's not a verbatim, but that inflammatory. And so, surprise, surprise, people were not too thrilled with his message because of his delivery. So I'm going to stop for a second. Now think about, let's say you're coaching a manager who has really high standards and can be really blunt and maybe sarcastic and contemptuous of his or her direct reports. And that manager is wondering, like, you know, how come, um, they don't care as much as I do. The story about Semmelweis, where it's somebody who was brilliant and had a really important message, but was shooting themselves in the foot, could be a really useful message for them. Or let's say you're coaching a young activist who's really super antagonistic and aggressive in their delivery of their important message, and they wonder why they're not getting a more receptive audience. The story, again, of Ignaz Semmelweis could be a useful, okay, let me look at that catalyst. And again, because it's a story about another person. Now, also, though, what Seth Godin talked about, which is another important takeaway message, which actually, to be honest, I had forgotten about until I reread the article I wrote about Semmelweis. I wrote it, I think it's close to 10 years ago. Um, but also what Semmelweis forgot to do, and this is super important, was he didn't really provide context for his message. He just gave like, hey, here's the takeaway. He didn't tell the story. He didn't talk about what made him start to wonder if it could be hand washing, and the the story arc, if you will, of his journey to discovery. So he didn't take the listener on a journey. And I can't remember if I mentioned this early, that I think of storytelling as an inward bound experience as opposed to like outward bound excursions, like sail in a sailboat way out in the ocean or be alone in the mountains for 14 days. That when you tell stories well, it's like a inward bound, that it's creating an experience like inside the person. And so that actually reminds me of one of my all-time favorite business-oriented books called Influencer, which is by the authors, the Vital Smarts. They just changed their name, but they were the team formerly known as Vital Smarts, who wrote Crucial Conversations, Crucial Confrontations, a couple other books. And in Influencer, one of the major points that they want people to get is, if you want to influence people, if you want people to like buy into your message, you can't just do like the takeaway message. You have to like take them on your journey and provide context for why you have this. It's sort of like the tip of the iceberg metaphor. So just like the top 10%. And if you only thought it was just this, let's say 10 feet of ice on top of the water, that's all you were dealing with, you're like, yeah, bring it on. You can take your boat and, bump into it. But knowing that there's a whole big iceberg underneath, it's like, yeah, I think I'll steer away from that. Sharing the storyline helps people understand in a full, more experiential way why you have your takeaway message. A simple example that I like to use, it's sort of like if, like say the movie Jurassic Park, kind of a dated reference, but it's kind of a classic movie. If you just said, like to somebody who never saw it before, oh, you should see, it's really cool. It's about dinosaurs that come to life. Person's like, okay, thanks. That doesn't capture the storyline. It doesn't capture the drama, the intensity of it. Now, if you're a good storyteller, you can tell some scenes, which makes the person think like, oh, wow, that sounds pretty cool. But there's nothing like actually sitting in the theater and experiencing that. And so the more you're able to tell stories well, it's more like they're actually experiencing what you've experienced and all that context to have your takeaway message. So the story of Ignaz Semmelweis is a great example of using a historical figure, something like, say, you read about in a book or see on a video, and then say, wow, like what are the lessons in this story? What are the teachable moments, teachable messages, and how can I use this in my coaching, in my presentations, my trainings? And again, as the genre of stories where it it challenges somebody in a way that's non-confrontational. Again, because it's just a story, they can just take it in without having to defend against it. And maybe they'll have an aha as you're sharing the story and see themselves in it. Or maybe they're like, oh, I'm not like that guy. But days, weeks, months, or maybe years later, it just finally clicks. So I just want to give you one more story to illustrate this genre of stories, how to use stories to challenge people without being confrontational. So this is a story that sometimes, again, I will tell in management training programs to help challenge, again, the sort of old school hardcore managers who think that being cognizant of employee emotions and understanding the emotional side of being a manager and their impact on people is like warm, fuzzy, touchy-feely, like, hey, I've got work to do. Don't waste my time with this. How to hopefully win them over and get them to self-reflect. And so sometimes I'll tell them this story. So I'm going to say it as if I'm saying it to a group. So one of the things that I think is so helpful um, to draw from is to draw from your own experience as an employee, over the years, and to think about ways that you've been treated that either make you want to give 110% and more gung ho, and interactions that you've had with bosses over the years that made you a whole lot less excited about giving 110%, or maybe just made you care less about whatever your boss cared about. Let me give you an example how sometimes it's easy to forget that. I was working with this company where I was asked to do some management training. And so, as I oftentimes do, I asked to meet with some of the people who would be attending the training. And so, one of the people that I met with, I think he was like a supervisor level. And it was interesting because he had sort of this smug, like smirky smile on his face. And and it's sort of like, oh, like, yeah, another one of these like trainer types. And he said something like, yeah, we've had a bunch of training. When I asked him something about like, what training have you had? What was useful? What was not useful? And he said something like, yeah, we've had a bunch of training. And, kind of that touchy feely stuff. And, that's, that's fine, but it's not really something that is relevant here. We're not a touchy-feely organization. Like we just, our company, we just do our work, and like that stuff doesn't really apply here. Something to that effect. And what was interesting to me as was before I asked him these questions, also in our interview, I had asked him about his interaction with, actually, it was that VP I mentioned earlier who had been very disrespectful, rude, etc., to employees. And when I asked him about that, he was really hurt and upset about it, and looked really wounded as he talked about that. And so it was interesting. So when he said that, like kind of smirky, like we're not touchy feely, we don't really need that stuff. And so I said something like, well, I'm curious because earlier when we were talking about how, I'll say the VP's name was Joe, how the way Joe treats you and others, how it affected you, it really seemed like it had a big effect on you. And it was so wild because this was like 15 years ago. And I can still picture like the smirk disappeared from this guy's face. And suddenly he looked like a 8-year-old boy who just got bullied in the playground. His face looked like hurt and sort of embarrassed or ashamed that he couldn't defend himself. And it was like he suddenly remembered, like, oh yeah, it doesn't feel good. Well, wait a minute, I'm saying all this like, oh, that stuff doesn't matter here, but I'm just remembering, yeah, it does matter a lot, because I hate it when Joe treats me that way, and it is on my mind a lot. I do feel hurt and resentful. And so I share that with you. So again, I'm in character, like giving it to speaking to the groups. I share that with you because it was easy for him with wearing his supervisor, kind of macho supervisor hat, like, hey, that stuff doesn't matter. Like our people just suck it up because like we're a bunch of tough guys. But then when he was reminded how he was affected by that, it's like, oh yeah, that stuff does matter. And so that's why one of the things I think is most useful for anybody in a supervisory, managerial, or leadership position is to think about those experiences of both things like moments of truth where they interacted with their supervisor that either um, boosted their morale and commitment or left them feeling misunderstood, disrespected, um, not trusted, etc. So I'm going to stop. So that's the last story I want to share with you. So just a short little vignette as a way to get that message across. But also one of the other values of telling stories is when you tell a person or a group a story, they're thinking about their own version of whatever the story was about. So they're thinking about their own examples of being disrespected. Or back to the Semmelweis example, they might be thinking of their own examples of like times when they were promoting an idea and maybe they were coming across too heavy-handedly, and they're like, oh, maybe that's what was going on. Or maybe telling that story, it made them think of somebody who was like just bludgeoning them with their message, and they didn't want to hear the message because of how overly intense or again, disrespectful the person was. So those are a bunch of different examples of how to use stories to communicate a message that might ordinarily be hard to hear if it was communicated directly. So how to communicate those messages in a way that's non-confrontational. So they could just hear it as a story, and maybe they can just take it in as a story. And again, as I mentioned earlier, hours, days, weeks, months, maybe even years later, it'll click. I mean, there's stories that I've heard years later where it's like, okay, I get it. Or experiences that I've had that at the time I wasn't ready to hear them. But when the time was right, it's like, okay, got it. So that's using stories to help people hear messages that they wouldn't ordinarily be able to hear. One of the most powerful and useful applications of storytelling.